Now, good evening, all. So I'm just going to go over just why we started the framework, why we started developing it, and why we believed it was needed. So, Shane, if you just go on to the next slide there. So, in IT Carlo at their last network, we had a revision of the 2016 conceptual framework. And some of the key takeaways we took from that were one was the need for a shared national understanding or definitions. And this was something that was really key so that higher education as a whole in Ireland could work from a common basis, so that we were all, let's say, working off the same hymn sheet, and that we all knew what the definitions that we could then individually expand upon. We also saw that there was too many definitions, too many principles in the initial framework, which made it, as many kind of overlapped, it also made it difficult for institutions to enact these principles in their day-to-day. Um, and so hopefully through the next framework we try to resolve that. Now, as well, another really important thing was to expand upon the concepts that were outlined in the 2016 report. There was an awful lot of really important principles that were taken away from that report, such as students as co-creators and not as consumers, which is a really important thing, and other principles like that we really wanted to bring forward when developing the new framework. And that was a big thing that was brought up in the revision of the 2016 conception framework. As well then was to also acknowledge the student engagement has evolved across the sector. There's been huge developments in the last number of years since the development of the conceptual framework. And it's really important that we recognise the work that has already been done within the sector and we build upon that work. And as well, with that, outlining and reflecting on the work of NSTEP, institutions and student unions that have all played a massive part the last few years in really pushing both student engagement and student partnership in the sector as a whole. Final thing is to draw from the experiences and expertise of students and staff across higher education, taking from the experiences of staff that have been involved in it since the launch of the 2016 conceptual framework, and as well always taking in the opinions and new ideas of students that are on the ground experiencing student engagement. So these are some of the key things that we took away from the conceptual framework in IT Carlo. If you just go on to the next slide there. Now, as well, when looking at why as well we needed to launch the steps to partnership and why we the necessity for it, we also saw that when we talk about student engagement, it can be often spoke about in a bubble. Whilst many of us are really, really involved in student engagement, we really are pushing for it, and we've made massive strides in in that area. We're still talking about it in a degree of a bubble. Now, it is ever expanding, but we need to be able to reach out to the other sections within higher education that aren't involved and to really burst that bubble and have a framework that all of higher education can build upon and rise up from. As well, the necessity for this framework is it creates that common foundation for us to build upon. Like I spoke about earlier, one of the key takeaways from the framework was that we needed common definitions across the sector so that we could all know what we were all talking about, and then we could institutions could redefine them to their specific situations, but then when talking within the sector, be able to relate back to these definitions one another, have that common basis, so that when one institution does start to make real progress, that the rest of higher education as a whole can learn from that experience, since we're all being able to learn off that same basis. And as well, it assists both students and staff within institutions to be able to recognise what is engagement in their institution and where engagement is actually being enacted within their institutions, both on the very local level to the governmental level and then also in the sectoral. And then as well to help them pursue it through that common foundation. And finally, as well, I think it helps us identify what's poor engagement, how to identify when there are institutions that are trying to go for engagement, but they may be lacking in certain areas. Having that common basis, that common framework, lets us identify it, lets us see what the drivers are, lets us see if we are actually pushing them, or are we using the 4455? And are they all being enacted? And where are the areas within our institutions that we may be lacking that we can then expand upon? because there's always somewhere we can be improving upon. And if you just go to the next stage then. And then finally, in terms of actually creating steps of partnership with the project team, who were fantastic and really, really engaging. And I think the first thing that we've reiterated time and time again was the framework was created in partnership. We had staff and students from wide and varied wide and varied experience and expertise, and different backgrounds as well, and experience within engagement, which led to really regular discussion throughout and debate. And I think this is a really key thing to highlight, that there were many areas, many times, where we didn't all agree, where we did have disagreement, and we were going back and forth. And it was through that debate and that discussion, we would usually come to a stage where we could all be satisfied with the end result that we come to, and that we all were able to agree on a finalized approach. And that was really important. But it was that we did have that debate, and that's really important when talking about partnership. That it's not that we always have to agree with the other side, or that we do push back, we do give our experiences, and that we are really propelling the argument and then coming to a common understanding. Now, I did mention that we had a very diverse opinions and experiences, and that was hugely beneficial. But again, as previously mentioned, when we talk about engagement, we do talk about it in that bubble. So one of the difficulties there as well is recognizing that the individuals we do have to try going forward to recognize that there are going to be those individuals that are never going to get involved in engagement or in the development of student engagement, student partnership, but we have to still try and recognize what their opinions will be when developing it. And that's something I do think we did well, but it's something we have to continuously try and improve upon. Another one of the biggest difficulties, and this is going to be a constant difficulty whenever trying to engage in partnership especially, is the time was always constrained. Students are always going to have their time in terms of lectures, in terms of societies, and their own lives as well. And then the same can be said for staff as well, who have monumental work that they're doing as well, which means it can be difficult coordinating. And that was one of the difficulties in developing the framework, was that time was a constraint, and there was times when we were debating things, when we were having really meaningful discussions, and that we had to cut it short because time was that constraint. And that's something that's not something that can be easily resolved, but it's important to recognize. And it is an acknowledgement that there is still much more discussion to still be had within the development of student engagement and student partnership within the sector. And then finally, the obvious one, but has to be mentioned, COVID also made an increased amount of difficulties, especially I think in discussion through online, as especially on the online format, you're limited in having those discussions that it's usually one individual talking. And it's usually a case where you can't have that side chat that's going on once two people are over here having the main discussion, and then an idea is generated that way. So it's important to recognize that, and it was a difficulty. I think we did a very good work in the project team at trying to overcome this, but this was something to acknowledge in the development. Now, with all that said, I do think the project team did monumental work, and I would just like to reiterate again the appreciation we have for the project team, because they were fantastic throughout the experience and really, really importantly, engaging throughout. Everyone gave their opinion. Everyone was really willing to, give their piece and give their opinion, and really push to making this framework the best it can be. So now I'm just going to, Oisin, if you move on to the next slide, I'm just going to pass you on to Sarah to talk about steps of partnership in a bit more detail.
Thanks for that, setting the scene, Stephen, and also the contribution from the student perspective in relation to membership on the project team. And thanks to you too, Kevin, for opening up the session today. I'm sorry that I'm not there in a live capacity, and there was a sudden change of events, unfortunately, so my apologies. I think that it's firstly really important to acknowledge the really significant accomplishment to arrive at a national launch date today, and to be very proud and excited about what's being provided to the sector today. To have accomplished this over a parallel time frame as a global pandemic adds just another layer of great accomplishment, I feel, to getting to this point. And I feel that Oisin and Jeffrey have navigated this space with great agility in making this significant timeline. So as a staff member on the project team, my observation over the time that the project team have been in place would be that there has been a very methodical and developmental approach to arriving at the framework that's being launched today. And the most striking part of that guided process for me was the sense that it was so truly consultative with the sector, with both staff and students who represented such a spectrum of roles and experiences across and within HEIs. As a project team, I felt and observed the dedication and investment that both staff and students took on throughout this process. And I particularly valued the student leadership throughout the process. The insights that were provided by the student cohort as part of our team, the professional facilitation provided all of the time by our student reps, and the articulate contributions that were offered at all times. I participated in and witnessed what I feel was a truly consultative and collaborative approach. At no point did it appear that there was a predetermined or prearranged messaging that came under the guise of one I prepared earlier, and that lent huge authenticity to the development of the framework in my eyes. So to refer to the slide that we're looking at here, this slide represents the concepts intended for this framework, and they were considered at length. So student voice, student engagement and student partnership, it became evident that members, maybe depending on their role or their status in a HEI or their experience, put varying levels of emphasis on different concepts. And there was a general consensus that these three concepts had a role in the development of a national framework, and it was important to share an understanding of each concept for the purposes of clarity and positioning for the sector. And whereas there is an interconnectedness between these concepts, there is similarly distinction and nuance. Student voice is a sharing of students' individual and lived experience within the learning community. Student engagement is a collective approach by staff and students to work together to shape decision making in higher education. And student partnership is the practice that drives forward and emerges from meaningful student engagement. Developmentally, the distinction made between these concepts sets the scene for how the framework has unfolded. Reflecting on how we have arrived at the framework that's being launched today, it made sense to me, I suppose, to refer back to the 2016 inaugural national document that was developed called Enhancing Student Engagement and Decision Making. And that really set out the first national position in Ireland related to the concept of student engagement, the drivers, the practice and principles of student engagement. And the work from that time possessed 3 drivers of student engagement with 10 principles and 3 institution level domains to facilitate student engagement activity. And from that point, which every new endeavour needs, there has been a time for sectoral feedback on the 2016 framework noted by Stephen, consultation with the sector throughout the development of a new framework, and then obviously input from the project team. And through all of that, there has been a refinement and a depth added to the framework being launched today, named Steps to Partnership. The elements of today's framework represent a number sequence, which you'll see on the slide here, and it's quite easy to remember, 4455. If I take the first 2 fours in the first instance, the 4 drivers articulate a culture of students as partners, the institution as a site of democratic citizenship, the institution as an inclusive learning community, and a culture of institutional reflection and enhancement. And they capture the cultural foundations in which an institution would seek to build an authentic ethos for student engagement. And the important addition in this part of the framework in comparison to the previous one is the inclusion of that culture of students as partners. And then if we look at the 4 domains, which are governance and management, teaching and learning, quality assurance and enhancement, and student representation and organisation, these are the vehicles for the drivers and identify the breadth of ownership, collaboration and action that any higher education institution in Ireland can access in some manner when they're adopting the framework. The primary addition in the domains from the previous framework is student representation and organisation. And much like the student-focused inclusion to the drivers, both of these newer and now formalised additions were included because they do a better job at representing partnership in its truest form. So then, if we look at the 5 principles in the framework, which are dialogue, trust, equity and inclusivity, empowerment, and students as co-creators, the discussion that the project team had about the principles was very extensive, and it was considered at length because of the large number of principles in the previous 2016 document when there was 10, and debate took place about the appropriateness of changing them, what was being sought through the actions of individuals and institutions, and could we be more brief with them while similarly maintaining their integrity. And that really meaty dialogue arrived at the 5 principles represented here, and a resolve that at their core they foster valuable and meaningful collaborative relationships. The 5 enablers then, capacity building, institutional approaches, supportive policies and processes, communities of practice and sustainability, are the main departure and addition from the previous framework, and a gap that was identified by the project team. The focus here became about naming how HEIs could enact practical, pragmatic and ambitious approaches. We felt by providing 5 enablers in a non-exhaustive way, it will capture an approach to supporting enhancement of student engagement and development of partnership approaches. I feel that the inclusion of the enablers brings a more adaptable and tangible layer to the framework, which is often something that can be a disconnect between national approaches and policies and applicability then at the local level. So finally, I suppose the framework is and should be interpreted as a journey, that for each individual institution will represent a number of steps. Our hope is that the starting point is where an individual institution is at and where there is a willingness and a capacity to act, knowing that there is much to be done. The beauty about small steps is that as they accumulate and as successes are accrued, there are dividends paid out to everyone involved. From my perspective, it has been a very worthwhile and enjoyable project to have been involved in, and I sincerely hope that the sector can see the value and the use the framework will have in each of their institutions.
Great. Many thanks to both Stephen and Sarah for that excellent presentation. We are going to now move to Q&A. At this point, I just wanted to take the opportunity to also say a word of thanks to Professor Colin Bryson, who was our international advisor in this project. Colin unfortunately couldn't be with us this morning, but his expertise and his pragmatism was an incredible asset to the development of the project, and we're forever indebted for his contribution to this project. Stephen is going to be joined by another member of the national project team, Dr. Amy Brennan. Amy is a lecturer in Irish educational policy and teacher education with expertise in the sociology and educational research at Marino Institute of Education. And she's also the founder of the Student Teacher Educational Research Project, which is a student staff partnership in educational research and publication. She's incredibly passionate about enhancing engagement in educational research, and as well as being a member of her project team, Amy is also a member of the NSTEP National Advisory Group for Student Engagement. So we're delighted to have Amy joining us this morning. And I'm going to kick off with questions. If you want to submit any questions, please submit those through the chat, and I will try to get through them in the next 10 or so minutes. So I'm going to kick off with Stephen. And Stephen, just coming from the student perspective, I was interested just on your observations around what you feel this framework means for students and for student representatives.
I I think what this framework really means is that it enables students to, especially in institutions that might not be hugely engaged in student engagement, student partnership, to be able to go to their institutions with this framework and be able to expand upon it from the student level, be able to go into institutions and push it. And as well, I think for then institutions that do have engagement, do have partnership, and are promoting the student voice, it allows students to be actively engaged. And again, like I said in the presentation, to recognise when their institutions are fulfilling true engagement and proper student engagement, as opposed to, let's say, the tokenistic kind that we do tend to see as well within the sector. So I think that's the main area for me that I see for students and student representatives.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Same question to yourself, but from the staff perspective, what do you feel this new framework really means for staff in terms of student engagement?
Thanks, Kevin. I think for me, what's really helpful is it takes away an element of abstraction. I think sometimes when we talk about student partnership, it can seem like kind of a woolly concept, or culture of partnership seems like something that's potentially overwhelming, whereas the framework is quite practical. It's not prescriptive, so it allows staff and institutions to consider how it will fit in their particular context, but it provides the kind of structure that I think is necessary to reflect on, as a staff member myself, to reflect on my own practice, to consider what the principles are, to consider are my values aligning, is my practice aligning in the domain of kind of teaching and learning. But then also to think about the enablers, like, can I talk to my colleagues, to my department, to my students about the enablers, and then how we can consider building in some kind of practical examples of meaningful engagement, I suppose. So it gives that kind of structure to start a dialogue, which I think is really helpful, because that's probably what's needed on the ground straight away, is really getting that dialogue moving, and the framework will give us an impetus for that, I suppose, to reprioritize and review our own practice.
Thanks very much. I'm going to another question then, and kind of picking up on the point that you made there, Amy, around the dialogue beginning. How does this document become a living and breathing entity within Irish higher education institutions from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably what we all want now, is to make this something that is going to be embedded in practice and in everything that we do. I think probably the first thing for me is that it needs institutional buy-in. I mean, obviously, to enact the framework and to really make engagement meaningful, we do need staff and students and kind of the leaders of institutions working together. But from a staff perspective, I certainly think we need institutional buy-in probably first. Like, when we talk about a culture of partnership, then to me, that's policy as well as practice, as well as leadership. So trying to consider how we can use this framework now and the document and this launch even to kind of get leadership and institutions on board to have the conversation about quality assurance and teaching and learning, to put partnership on the agenda at those conversations, particularly kind of this time of year. Maybe twice a year we'll be talking about programme reviews, looking at learning objectives, looking at assessment and feedback. And what we want is to have this document on the table, to be looking at the framework while those conversations are happening. And I think that probably has to start with kind of institutional level conversations, and then really get staff and students involved as that develops.
Great, thanks, Amy. And I might pose the same question to yourself, Stephen. How do you think that this document can become a living and breathing entity within Irish higher education institutions?
I think my audio should be a bit better there. I think when talking about how we can, I think it's through really engaging with it and having institutions and students and staff properly engaging with it and utilising it, and it doesn't just become a document that we put up and we go, that looks very nice, and then we don't talk about it again. I think it's actively using it, and that comes in as well in terms of units and end step as well, to actively be building upon it and to be referencing it back as well, that we are looking at it and we're taking the concepts and the ideas we've developed in it and then utilizing them when talking about it, bringing it forward and when developing it. And I think then it will become embedded in one sense and become something that's, again, that foundation that we do use, and that will allow it then to be as well developed and become that living and breathing in the sector.
Great, thank you, Stephen. I'm seeing a few questions coming through the chat. I'm going to go to a question here from Graham Glanville, who is also a member of the project team for the framework. And the question's for Stephen, and he asks, do you think this new framework will allow students who are not familiar with the concept of partnership to understand and engage with this concept?
I think yes, definitely in one sense, and because it'll allow students that aren't actively engaged, that are outside that bubble, to be able to easily see what is partnership, what is engagement on a simplistic level, and then they can see if it's being enacted within their institutions, be able to see, oh yeah, I can get involved. That's what partnership is. I'm able to do that, or when it is actively happening, for them to be able to recognize. I think that's a big thing. It's that for a lot of students when they're coming in, they don't really know what is partnership, what is engagement. They kind of think of it, they don't understand the concept. So this gives a really nice baseline. I think you're always going to have students that are going to be less engaged, but this will allow, you would hope with this framework as well, that student partnership, student engagement, student voice will become such an innate thing within the sector that it won't even be a question. It will just be something that's within the institution, and students can say, oh yeah, student partnership, I can do that project. That's I'm working with some staff and developing something, and it won't even have to be something that we need to think about. And students that aren't engaged don't necessarily need to get engaged in the developmental process because it's already.
Great, thank you, Stephen.
And those students that do want to engage can go into.
Sorry, go ahead. The choice is in.
No, I think that was it there. I was just finishing anyway.
Perfect, thank you. I see another question in the chat, which I might put to yourself, Amy, and it comes from Kyle, who asked, do you have any advice on how to sell student partnership to staff who feel overworked and like this would be an extra step?
Yeah, that is the question, isn't it, really? I think there's a particular approach that we can take, and yeah, it's a brilliant question. I think we have to appreciate the genuine, challenges that are in place. There are real challenges for staff. I think we have to start there, and try not to be critical of current practice, that we're advocating, all of us here. I mean, probably everybody in this room could be considered an early adopter, if you like, where we all buy into this concept, but not everybody does. So I think it's our responsibility, all of us. I mean, I consider it my own responsibility to advocate for partnership practice, but how we do that, I mean, highlighting the misinterpretations or the misconceptions that are out there about partnership, kind of moving away from that idea of students as consumers, or giving up power, is sometimes, or giving up authority can sometimes be the misconception that comes along with partnership, so trying to challenge those misconceptions when they do come up. But also I think that we need to talk about the principles of partnership, the values. And that can sometimes be an uncomfortable conversation to have, because certainly as staff, we're much more comfortable with, evidence and research and facts, but having the conversation about values and giving personal experiences of partnership, which is messy. I mean, it doesn't always work neatly. I mean, certainly in my experience, I've been involved in a fantastic partnership project, which is, it's really rewarding. I love working with the students, but yeah, there are practical challenges. So actually talking about those challenges and having that be part of the process of partnership and, being honest about that, I think that can be really helpful to staff who maybe want to learn more about it and might be open to getting involved, but, are worried about that vulnerability or that risk that comes with opening themselves up and kind of challenging their own practice. But also I think NSTEP can be really helpful with this too, because continuing the national conversation, seeing this framework as a starting point for dialogue with colleagues and with staff, but a starting point, you know, something that is continuing. It's kind of like a new chapter, you know, that's how I would see it. And hopefully bringing some of the staff who are a little bit more hesitant maybe on board with the next conversation.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to go to one final question from the chat, and it comes from Diana Stenek, who's the president of the National College of Ireland Students' Union. And Diana talks about the idea of culture and the fact that culture is often quite difficult to change. So from the perspective of the fact that student officer terms are quite short, she's asking, how do you believe somebody can start to shift that culture within an institution? And I might start off with Stephen and then go to Amy.
I think that's a really interesting question, actually, and I think it's a really good one. I think when you're looking at the culture, one, it's not something that changes overnight, and that's something to really recognize, that it is going to take a long time. And yes, sabbatical times can be short, and when you're getting new union officers in, they have different priorities. But I think one we're looking at the sectoral level at the moment, and we're trying to actively promote it in the sector. But I think as well, when talking to institutions, is acknowledging the benefits of student engagement, student partnership, how, you know, getting the perspectives of students in can really then benefit the institution as a whole. That gets a lot more institutional buy-in, that then they push it within their cultural. So you're pushing from the top down there. And as well then, in terms of the work with NSTEP through, let's say, the student rep training, where we're constantly pushing that kind of a culture of that partnership and engagement, and how to giving them the skills so that they can unlock their potential at pushing it from the ground level as well. And I think that's a big thing that we've said before, that we're pushing it from both levels, and that it will take time. But if we keep pushing it, that we're showing the benefits, that we will start to have that cultural change. And I think, again, the big thing I want to reiterate is that it's not something that's going to happen over a short period. It will take a long time, but as institutions see the benefits of it, they'll be more and more willing to engage in it.
Perfect. Thank you, Stephen. And Amy, same question yourself. Your thoughts around building that institutional culture?
Yeah, and I really like Stephen's input there, where he's talking about bringing it in from both ends, you know, that you need the institutional buy-in that I was mentioning at the beginning. But I suppose from a staff point of view, I mean, I would be looking at trying to change the culture by showcasing examples of partnership, you know, like be the change, as corny as that sounds, but you know what I mean, that you're trying to, if it's something you believe in. I mean, it's something that I do, certainly with my project. I feel that, you know, the STEER project encourages students to work with staff. I've been able to bring in more staff within the institution to become part of that staff student team. It's now become kind of part of discussions that staff are having. And it's a gradual process, but it started with, you know, an idea that I had with my students, and it has gradually grown, and then more staff have become part of the conversation. So I think that is how you change a culture. It's small steps, but we each have a responsibility to start with our own practice and what, you know, our own context.
Great. Thank you very much, Amy. And on behalf of everybody, just to say a huge sort of thanks to both Stephen and Amy for not only their contributions this morning, but their contributions to the development of this framework.